today? Love can build a bridge. Who thinks it's time? Right? Oh, how many of you find it hard? Find it hard, right, to be in this constant place of loving one another. Right? It's not an easy task. So I find it hard. I find it hard. So we're here to talk about how can we support and encourage one another to be that. So we are starting this new year with a whole new series of topics around this idea of perfect vision, seeing through a spiritual lens. Right? So seeing life, seeing our relationships, seeing everything through this spiritual lens. And so last week, we're starting with this series of Who Are We, which is basically our basic unity teachings, ideas, principles that can help us to see through that spiritual lens. And so we're starting with what are our basic unity teachings. And last week, we talked about the idea of God. We started out small last week. Right? What is God? And so all of you were invited and encouraged into the practice of moving into the activity of your week with eyes open to see God through the activity of your week. How many of you took on that practice over this past week? Okay, awesome. So because I know that if you take these practices on and do this, there's going to be some understanding that is going to come to you. And we inspire one another as we share what we learned from this practice this week. So did anybody who practiced want to share? I see Marilyn's hand went up very quickly. Yay, Marilyn. Marilyn Velkerdine.
Good morning, everyone. I have two things I'd like to share with, although I had other epiphanies through the week. But one of the things was, as I meditated, I set the intention to see through the eyes of unconditional love and, to see if I could see people through God's eyes. And so I went to two meetings where often certain people really tee me off, which isn't unconditional love, but they were glorious meetings. I felt so peaceful in them. So God was definitely present with me, and I enjoyed seeing through God's eyes. And then this morning I had a really fun one because I was sitting in meditation, and a little voice spoke to me, and it said, "You are without error." And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then I immediately realized I had told someone the wrong date for a meeting. And so I got to tell them the correct date. So that was good. It was just, it's fun and it was loving.
So I hear in your experience of seeing God and through God's eyes, a sense of peace, a sense of joy. Thank you, Marilyn. Thank you. Anybody else want to share? Yeah, John. John McFarland.
So my brother lives in Florida. He's older brother. And it's taken me a long time to really recognize some of his issues. He has a lot of depression, and he's had it for a long time. And I've been working really hard that when I talk with him on the phone to look through the eyes of unconditional love and try and constantly turn things into a positive reinforcement instead of getting irritated with his issues. And it's been very difficult, but it's been very rewarding for me to constantly take those steps. And so that was part of my practice. Again, it's not daily, but it's a couple times a week.
That's where it starts, John, wherever we are. So challenging to love unconditionally. Let's just be honest. Let's just be real with one another. It's challenging to see with unconditional eyes, but rewarding when you can put it into practice. All right, so thank you for those of you who shared. I did say last week that maybe I'd have a prize for you, for the best one, the best place that you saw God. So here's your prize, and this is for all of us. What you experience from within when you put this into practice, the place of peace, the place of joy, That's your prize, right? It doesn't come from me. It doesn't come from outside of you. It comes from living into these teachings and living into these ideas. And the beauty of unity is that you will experience positive, powerful, practical transformation if you do the work. Right? So this is what we talk about each week. So today we're moving on to the conversation of what about Jesus. So last week we took on God. This week we're taking on Jesus. We're starting the year right. Now I'm going to begin by telling you that this is a little bit challenging for me, and the reason is because I have been here for 5 years sharing my thoughts about who Jesus is, and sometimes in my sharing those thoughts about how we see Jesus, I hear people who have been here saying to me, oh, well, I didn't realize Unity believed that. I don't know that this is my community anymore, right? So I'm sharing these teachings of what Unity realizes and understands about Unity, knowing that this might hit something in you because it's not what you imagined it was from what you learned growing up. So I grew up in very traditional Christianity in the Catholic tradition, right? Where I was taught about Jesus 8 years, going through parochial school, Catholic school, learning about who Jesus is. He came, he was the Son of God, he was the exception, he was here to save me, all of that. I learned that. Anybody else learn that?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Unity looks at Jesus in a slightly different way. No surprise if you've been here involved in Unity at all. We tend to look at things in slightly different ways, and it may resonate with you and it may push your buttons. So I'm going to preface it with that. So Unity teaches, this is the statement that I've made before that have caused people to leave. No judgment around their leaving. They just got clear, this is not my place. Unity teaches that Jesus is not the exception. Jesus is the example.
Yes. Amen.
Yes. Not the exception, but the example. And so he came to show us the way. So much of Christianity is about making a religion about Jesus. Unity is about a movement about the way that Jesus taught us to walk in order to fully shine our light and be that unconditional love of God expressing through every area of our life. And what does that take? I go to a question that was given to Jesus. He was questioned by the spiritual leaders of his time, the religious leaders of his time, which appears to be the ones that Jesus had the most issue with, right? The ones that he called out, the ones that he called hypocrites, right? And they called him out and they said, Jesus, we see that your disciples don't fast. John the Baptist's disciples fast, but your disciples don't fast. How is that they don't fast? And he goes into this different explanations about it, but one of the things that he says that sticks with me about how we need to show up to follow the way of Christ is he tells them in that, he gives them this little story about how you cannot put new wine into old wineskins. You cannot put new wine into old wineskin. Anybody here a winemaker? No. Oh, okay. Who drinks? Sorry. Okay, so here's what happens. When you're making wine and it is going through that fermentation process, it's going to cause a lot of escape of gases, and if that wineskin were not new, that wineskin would burst. It wouldn't be able to hold that wine as it's being made, as it's being fermented. It would burst. It would be destroyed. A new wineskin has flexibility. It's supple. It expands. As the wine is expanding, that new wineskin expands with it. So what is Jesus saying to us with this statement, you cannot put new wine into old wineskins? And for me, it means, and in Unity, it means that you can't put a new idea into an old mindset. If we have our mind already made up,
Can't teach a dog new tricks.
You can teach a dog new tricks, right? But that's the mindset, right?
Exactly.
You can't teach an old dog new tricks. You can't teach me something new. You know how old I am, Joanne? Right, whatever we keep a closed mind about because we think we already know the answer, Jesus is saying when we do that, it doesn't allow for a transformation of our minds. Be ye renewed.
It doesn't allow for a transformation of our bodies.
It doesn't allow for a transformation, period. Right? So that's step one. We have to be willing to come to it, to see things with new eyes, from a new perspective, from a fresh mind, from what Buddhists would call beginner's mind. Right? Let me come, get out of my I know, and get back to this place of I don't know. Right? So, number one, we have to be willing to come into following the way from this perspective that I've got something new to learn here. That I've got something to grow through here. That I don't know it all. These same religious leaders that asked Jesus this question also asked him if he came to change the law. Because in the Jewish tradition, there are over 600 laws that are defined that you have to follow in order to restore God's kingdom here on earth. And the religious leaders of Jesus' day knew the letter of that law. And Jesus called them out on that. He said, you may know the letter of the law, but do you know the spirit of the law? Do you know what's behind the law? He said, I didn't come to change the law. I came to fulfill the law. And how does the fulfillment of the law come about? How do we restore the kingdom of heaven here on earth? Do we have to remember 600 plus rules to do that? Jesus said, no, you need to know two. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And love your neighbor as yourself.
Don't forget to
Love. 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 And then Jesus was asked after that, so who's your neighbor? Right, because as human beings, we're always looking for where's our out. Right, like surely that one, you're not talking about that one that I have to love, right? So we're looking for that out. So they asked him, so who's our neighbor? And Jesus goes on to share this story, this parable of the Good Samaritan. Now I know you all know this story, right? There was a man who was laying hurt, bleeding, unconscious in the road. Along comes those religious leaders who are on their way to temple. Now, what you have to know is that in the Jewish tradition, there was this idea of who and what was clean and who and what was not clean. So not clean is somebody who's bleeding. And those religious leaders, in order to enter into the temple, needed to be clean. So therefore, they chose not to help that one who was laying there unconscious and bleeding because it meant that they would be unclean and then could not go into temple. You know the letter of the law. And then after they pass by, along comes a Samaritan. Now what you need to know about the Samaritans is that they were known as less than the Jewish people because they were of mixed race. They too were unclean, if you will. Right? And so here along comes the Samaritan who sees this Jew laying here, bleeding, unconscious, and stops to help. And this is the story that Jesus offers to know who is your neighbor. In those days, you know, that Samaritan that's there helping would not have been somebody that they would have seen as an instrument of the divine. And yet here it is, Jesus saying, yes, this one is. Much more so than the religious leaders, right? Because it takes getting out of our head. It takes getting out of the rules and the laws. And it takes getting into our heart and saying, I will be that unconditional love that is God with whoever is in front of me. This is the way that Jesus gave us, the path that we are to walk. Now, I don't think he thought it was easy, because what he also said was, take up your cross and follow me. Not put aside your cross and follow me. Catch it? But to acknowledge whatever it is that's challenging for you, that you're carrying with you. Acknowledge the place that you are caught up in judgment and unforgiveness and victimhood and blame. Acknowledge those ways that you don't understand. Acknowledge it. Pick those ways up and then follow me. And follow him to what? Follow him to what?
Heaven on earth.
Heaven on earth, Rita. Heaven on earth revealed when we love one another. Jesus was a radical of his days. You have to understand that. He was radically inclusive of people that in his time were considered the marginalized. He hung out, remember, with the tax collectors and the prostitutes and the sinners of his day. He hung out with the women. He hung out with those lepers, right? He hung out with the marginalized of his day and simply loved them. And offered to each one an opportunity to see that we can transform our lives when we live into these ideas of being that unconditional love with one another. Now, who finds that hard? Let's acknowledge it. We find it hard, and that's okay, because we have the answer. We have the solution within us, and what is that? Love. Not the emotion of love.
Prayer.
That emotion of love that we move into and out of. That we can say, I love you today and not tomorrow. That is not what we're talking about. We are talking about the power of love. That we can, yes, Christy, access as we go into times of prayer and meditation, turning within, not looking in the world for it, turning within to that Christ light and that Christ spirit that is within us, that was within Jesus, and that he so perfectly demonstrated that he became our teacher and our way shower. When we become willing to follow that way. So I was kind of curious, like, how would we define the marginalized in our world today, right? So for Jesus, it was the tax collectors, it was the prostitutes, it was those that were not Jewish, the Gentiles, the unclean, right? Those were the marginalized of his day. So I Googled it. Isn't it beautiful we can Google, like, who are the marginalized in our society today? And the answer arises. So this comes from Minnesota, the Psychological Association of Minnesota. And these are some of the people, okay, not a complete list, but some of the people that they have indicated are the marginalized of our world today. Senior citizens, racial and cultural minorities, military combat veterans, persons of below average intelligence, hearing, visually, and physically challenged persons, persons with a serious and persistent mental illness, persons with cognitive impairments, gamblers, substance abusers, people on the autism spectrum, gifted and talented persons, persons with disfigurements, persons living in poverty, sex offenders, the homeless, felons, our LGBTQ family, all listed here as part of the marginalized populations that you and I are called to acknowledge and then see God within them, love them unconditionally. So I want to return to last week, when I shared with you as a community an opportunity that we had to support our family who identifies as LGBTQ and who asked us whether or not we could have a system in place where people who wanted to, optionally, could let us know what their preferred pronoun was. And we announced that last week. Now, everybody who came to me, because this is what you all do, you come to me and say, "Oh, that was fabulous, Joanne. I am so proud of our community. I am so proud that we're doing this." So I hear the good stuff. And then, along through the grapevine, comes the other reactions. "What are we doing this for? I don't understand this. This makes no sense to me. This is stupid." Further division. And then the people in the middle, God bless you, who said, "I get it, but I'm really confused about the grammar." And everything in between. Do you catch that? Everything in between. And so what do we as a spiritual community have to learn and grow through with this? Well, number one, I and all of us need to accept that there are people everywhere on that spectrum. That we accept those who are asking for this change, and that we accept those who are here resisting those changes. That acceptance is here. I get that we don't all understand it. But remember, we are talking about a marginalized segment of our population. A marginalized segment of our population that may not experience safety walking into every spiritual community. That may, in fact, receive judgment walking into certain spiritual communities. But we want you to know that you're safe here. As people ask, why do we have to have this conversation? Because I am an ally. And you may not realize it. I'm sure some of you realize that in your lifetime, it was illegal to be a person who identified as LGBTQ, illegal in our lifetimes. And that still today, in the state of Ohio, you can be fired from your job and you can be evicted from your home if you identify as LGBTQ because there are no systems in place to protect you. And we are an ally. And we welcome you. And we want you to feel accepted here. Now, I do hope that the day comes where we don't have to be talking about things like what is your gender identity and what is your sexual preference and all of those other things, where we can just skip all of that and go right to the oneness. Wouldn't that be great? But we're not there. Our society is not there, and it doesn't do us any good to stick our heads in the sand and say, let's just go there. And so for those reasons, we have begun this program. That is an optional program. And that what we ask of each one coming through these doors is one thing: to simply love, respect, and honor that one that is before you. And if for them that means that you refer to them as a they, them, even if you don't get it, that you do so because you love and respect and honor them. And if you are sitting here today and that's still pushing your buttons, I get it. And I love and respect and honor you as well. Pick up your cross. Come follow us. It may not be easy, it may push your buttons, it may stretch you beyond what's comfortable, but all you're asked to do is love one another, period. Who's going to join me with that this week? Yes. So because I do need practice, and I'm guessing I'm not alone, we do have a spiritual practice in our bulletin today. I want you to think about the characteristics of Jesus as demonstrated through his life. Jesus was a radical, radically inclusive, radically forgiving, radically understanding. He was courageous. He spoke his truth in spite of the pushback that he got from the people who were the leaders of his day. What characteristic of Jesus would you like to take on this week? Live into? And I'm going to encourage you, as I do in here, make it something that you feel like you could easily attain. Like, don't go to the hardest one to begin with. Choose something a little easier. But claim it. Know that just like Jesus, you have that Spirit of God within you to support you in being that. And that as you and I follow this way of unconditional love for God and for one another, we will reveal, Rita, the kingdom of heaven here on earth. Doesn't that sound fabulous?
Yes.
Beautiful.
If it were easy, don't you think we'd have done it by now? So just acknowledge with me. This is hard stuff, Christy. This is hard stuff, Barry. This is hard stuff, John. But what of value does it require some effort from us? And so, this week, I am going to incorporate into my life the way of Christ as taught and demonstrated by Jesus. For me, that will be looking through the eyes of love this week for each one that is in front of me. And then, what can I do to incorporate that into my life? What can you do to follow that way of Christ? Jesus as our example and not the exception. Who's with me on this? All right, that's a lot of hands. We can do this. We can do this. And I know it because, as our scripture says, Christ in you is your hope of glory. Christ is in you. Christ is in each and every one here. And therein lies your hope of glory, where you will find whatever you need to rise up and to be that. And together, as we do that, our lives will transform. And that's what it's all about. Even though the kids told me today it was the hokey pokey, but that's what it's all about. Thank you. God bless.